I came back from my father's funeral with a heavy leather briefcase clutched in my hand. Inside that worn bag sat the deeds to 3 massive commercial farms in Iowa and a sprawling coastal estate in Monterey. $18 million in raw, unencumbered assets. My heart was racing as I walked up the paved driveway of the Lincoln Park home I shared with my son. I was finally going to save him. He had been drowning in business debt, looking more exhausted every day, and I finally had the ultimate lifeline to throw him. But before my fingers could even touch the brass doorknob, I heard voices floating through the slightly open kitchen window. And the words spoken inside that house froze the blood in my veins. If you have ever felt the stinging, unforgivable betrayal of your own flesh and blood, hit the like button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of my story. Because what I did next shocked everyone. I am Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and for 40 brutal years, I laid bricks, poured concrete, and inhaled construction dust so my son Bradley could have a life of absolute privilege, a life I never had. 2 days ago, I buried my 95-year-old father back in Iowa. It was a quiet, solemn service, just a handful of old farmers paying their final respects to a man who worked until his dying day. I flew back to Chicago a full day early because I simply could not wait to tell Bradley the incredible news. He is a chief financial officer, a smart, ambitious kid, 35 years old. But lately, the financial stress had been eating him alive. He told me his tech firm was struggling, that he was barely keeping the lights on at work and at home. I hated seeing my only son suffer. When my father passed and left me that staggering portfolio, I did not think of myself. I thought of Bradley and his beautiful wife, Megan. I thought about how this massive inheritance would wipe away their tears, clear their debts overnight, and secure our family name for generations to come. I parked my truck a block away so I could walk up and surprise them. The Chicago wind was biting that afternoon, but I did not feel the cold. I felt a profound warmth in my chest, a desperate, foolish pride. I had sunk my entire life savings, $400,000, into the down payment for this beautiful Lincoln Park home 3 years ago. It was my late wife's life insurance payout, combined with every single penny I ever squeezed out of the dirt. I lived in the small guest room upstairs, genuinely believing we were a happy family, believing I was respected and loved in my old age. I stepped onto the front porch, carefully avoiding the creaky wooden floorboard I had meant to fix last weekend. The heavy oak door was solid, but the side window by the kitchen was cracked open just an inch to let out some cooking smoke. I raised my hand to knock a wide smile on my face, but Megan's voice drifted out. It was sharp and dripping with an icy, calculated satisfaction that made me stop dead in my tracks. "Are you completely sure the deposit cleared?" she asked. I heard the familiar hiss and pop of a beer bottle opening. Bradley's voice followed, relaxed, arrogant, almost amused by the question. "Yes, Megan. The wire transfer to Shady Pines went through this morning. The bed is officially reserved and paid for. Shady Pines." The name hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. It was a notorious state-funded nursing home on the bleak edge of the city. A miserable, decaying place where forgotten people were dumped by their families to rot in sterile, understaffed hallways. Megan laughed, a bright musical sound that I used to think was so charming. Well, thank God. I absolutely cannot stand another week of him shuffling around here, getting in the way and smelling like Old Spice and joint cream. But what about the deed? Are you positive he cannot fight the sale of the house? We need that cash to leave. I stopped breathing. The leather briefcase in my right hand suddenly felt like a block of solid lead. Sell the house. What exactly were they talking about? My dad is a clueless old man, Bradley chuckled. He sounded so incredibly arrogant, so utterly detached from the fact that he was talking about his own flesh and blood. He actually thought he was signing a complex state tax rebate form last month. I slid the quitclaim deed right into the middle of the stack of papers. He surrendered his entire ownership stake, Megan. He has absolutely no legal right to this property anymore. Tomorrow morning, the transport van from Shady Pines arrives to pick him up. We tell him it is a temporary physical therapy retreat for his joints. By the time he figures out he is never coming back, we will have the house listed his $400,000 safely in our private accounts, and we will be booking our one-way flights to Aspen. He has absolutely no value to us anymore. The state will subsidize his cheap meals so we will not have to spend a single dime of our own money. I stood frozen on that porch, the freezing wind whipping around my collar. My own son. The boy I had taught to throw a baseball in the park. The boy I had sacrificed my physical body to put through an expensive elite university. He had looked me right in the eye, smiled, handed me a pen, and stolen everything I had left in this world. And Megan, the woman who smiled so sweetly at me every single morning and lovingly called me Dad, was standing in the very kitchen my money paid for, excitedly counting the hours until I was hauled away like a bag of garbage. I slowly looked down at my hands. They were trembling, covered in thick calluses and age spots. I traced the deep, jagged scar across my left palm, a permanent souvenir from a collapsed scaffolding beam in 1998. I remembered working a grueling double shift with a fractured rib just to make sure Bradley's college tuition was paid on time. I thought about the $400,000. That was not just money. That was the sweat of my lost youth. That was the agonizing payout from the insurance policy when aggressive cancer tore my beautiful wife from my arms. It was my blood, my tears, my entire life. The profound grief I had been carrying from my father's funeral vanished in a fraction of a second. It was entirely consumed by a creeping sub-zero rage that settled deep into my bones. They thought I was a clueless old man. They thought a man who spent 40 years managing cutthroat construction crews, negotiating with corrupt suppliers and fighting for every inch of ground, would just quietly sign away his life and fade into a miserable asylum without a fight. I looked at the heavy leather briefcase in my hand. $18 million. Enough money to buy and sell Bradley 10 times over. A massive fortune he was about to inherit simply by being a decent human being. I turned around quietly and walked back down the driveway, my boots making no sound on the pavement. I went straight to my truck, unlocked the heavy steel toolbox, bolted to the truck bed, and shoved the leather briefcase inside. I closed the lid and locked it twice. I took a deep breath of the freezing Chicago air. I let my shoulders slump forward. I forced my hands to shake a little more than usual, perfectly plastering on the exhausted, frail, pathetic look of a grieving widower. I walked back up the driveway, turned the brass doorknob, and stepped blindly into the lion's den. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. The foyer of the Lincoln Park house was bathed in the warm, ambient light of a crystal chandelier. The air smelled of expensive vanilla candles and roasting meat. It was the smell of a home completely undisturbed by grief. I let my heavy boots drag against the imported hardwood floors, intentionally making my steps sound unsteady and weak. I hunched my shoulders forward, letting the physical exhaustion of the flight and the emotional devastation of burying my father show plainly on my face. I heard the sharp, rapid click of heels against the kitchen tile. Megan rounded the corner wearing a pristine white silk blouse and tailored beige slacks. The moment she saw me, her face contorted into a mask of exaggerated performative sympathy. It was a flawless performance. If I had not just heard her gleefully plotting my exile through the open window, I would have believed every second of it. Dad. She gasped, her voice practically dripping with manufactured sorrow. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around my shoulders, squeezing me in a tight, suffocating embrace. "Oh, Dad, we are so incredibly sorry. We did not expect you back until tomorrow evening. How was the flight? Are you completely exhausted?" I allowed my body to remain stiff and passive in her arms. "The flight was long," I muttered, making my voice sound thin and raspy. "I just wanted to come home." "It was a hard day, Megan." Bradley emerged from the kitchen right behind her. He held a glass of imported craft beer in his hand, his posture relaxed, his custom-fit button-down shirt rolled up at the sleeves. He looked like a man without a single care in the world, certainly not a man drowning in business debt. He walked over and placed a firm, seemingly reassuring hand on my shoulder. "I am so sorry about Grandpa, Dad," Bradley said, his tone thick with practiced gravity. "I really wish we could have been there with you. Work has just been an absolute nightmare lately. The firm is going through a massive restructuring phase, and I am barely holding everything together." I looked directly into my son's eyes. They were clear and steady, completely devoid of guilt. He was lying to my face with the ease of a seasoned predator. "I understand, Bradley," I said quietly, forcing a weak, forgiving smile. "You have a lot on your plate. You have to take care of your own house first." Megan stepped back, keeping one hand gently on my arm. She exchanged a swift, nearly imperceptible glance with Bradley. It was the look of a hunter confirming the trap was set. She reached over to the entryway console table and picked up a glossy, heavy stock folder. "Dad, since you are home early, Bradley and I actually have something very important we want to talk to you about," Megan said, her voice dropping to a soft, soothing register. "We know this is a terrible time, but we have been so incredibly worried about you lately, especially with your knees acting up and now with the grief of losing Grandpa. We just want to make sure you have the absolute best care possible." She pressed the glossy folder into my calloused hands. I looked down at the cover. The words, "Shady Pines Retirement Community," were embossed in cheerful, calming green letters over a stock photo of smiling, active seniors playing chess. "What is this?" I asked, letting my hands tremble slightly as I held the brochure. Bradley stepped closer, adopting the tone of a deeply concerned martyr making a tough sacrifice. "Dad, we love having you here. We really do. But this house, with all these steep stairs and the constant commotion, it is just becoming a safety hazard for you. You stumbled on the landing just last week. What if you fall when we are not home? My business is taking a massive hit right now, and I am working 80-hour weeks. Megan is overwhelmed managing the property. We simply cannot provide the around-the-clock attention you deserve." Megan nodded vigorously, her eyes wide with feigned empathy. "Exactly, Dad. Shady Pines is a wonderful place. They have 24/7 medical staff on call. They have a heated pool for aquatic physical therapy, dedicated nutritionists, and community events. You would not have to worry about cooking or cleaning or climbing stairs ever again. You would be surrounded by people your own age. It is basically a luxury resort." I stared at the brochure in my hands. A luxury resort. I knew exactly what Shady Pines was. Everyone in the city knew what it was. It was a bleak, underfunded state facility where the air always smelled of bleach and despair. It was the final dumping ground for the unwanted. And they were trying to package it as a vacation. A retirement home. I murmured, staring blankly at the polished marble floor. I let my voice waver perfectly, simulating the shock and confusion of a vulnerable old man being gently nudged out of his own home. "But I have my room upstairs. I do not want to be a burden to you two. I can just stay out of the way." "You are never a burden." Dad, Bradley lied effortlessly, his grip tightening on my shoulder. "This is about your health. With the business bleeding money the way it is, I cannot afford a private in-home nurse. We found a subsidized program at Shady Pines that will cover your living expenses so you do not have to worry about draining your retirement funds. It is the smartest, safest move for everyone." My gut instinct screamed violently against my ribcage. If the business was bleeding money, if Bradley was truly on the verge of financial ruin, then how could they explain the kitchen island? Just over Bradley's shoulder, sitting casually on the pristine white granite countertop, was a brand-new charcoal gray designer handbag. I recognized the logo instantly because I had seen the exact same bag in a high-end boutique window downtown just last month. It carried a price tag of over $5,000. You do not buy $5,000 leather bags when your company is failing. You do not pop expensive craft beers and laugh in the kitchen when you are supposedly drowning in massive debt. The entire narrative was a carefully constructed, flawless lie designed to push me out the door without a single fight. I looked away from the handbag and back to my son. I swallowed hard, forcing a look of tired resignation onto my face. I needed them to believe they had won. I needed them to feel completely undeniably secure in their victory. "If you really think this is what is best for my health," I whispered, handing the glossy brochure back to Megan. "If it takes the pressure off your business, Bradley, then I will go look at it. I trust your judgment, son." The relief that washed over their faces was instant and sickening. Bradley actually exhaled a heavy sigh, patting my back affectionately. "Thank you, Dad. I knew you would understand. We scheduled a private tour for you on Friday morning. It is going to be great, you will see." "Friday," I replied, nodding slowly. "Okay. Friday. Now, if you both do not mind, I am incredibly tired from the flight. I am just going to go upstairs and rest for a bit." "Of course, Dad." Megan chirped, her voice instantly returning to its usual bright, energetic pitch. "Let me know if you need me to bring up a tray of food." I declined politely and turned toward the grand staircase. Every step up those wooden treads felt like climbing a mountain. I could practically feel their eyes on my back, watching the frail, defeated old man shuffle out of their way. But the moment I reached the upper landing and stepped into the shadowy confines of my small guest room, the frail posture vanished completely. I locked the bedroom door behind me and stood up straight. My breathing was slow, deep, and measured. The game had officially begun. They had shown their hand, and now it was time for me to verify the extent of the damage. I walked over to the small, modest desk in the corner of my room and opened my old laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room with a harsh, cold light. When my wife passed away, and I sold our family home to fund this Lincoln Park property, Bradley had insisted on setting up a joint bank account. He told me it was strictly for emergencies, a way for him to help manage my funds and ensure my $400,000 nest egg was safely earning interest. For 3 years, I had trusted him implicitly. I rarely checked the balance, believing my son was acting as my faithful financial guardian. I navigated to the banking portal and typed in my username. My fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as I entered my long-standing password. The little loading circle spun for a fraction of a second before a stark red error message flashed across the screen. "Incorrect password." I frowned, assuming I had simply made a typo in my exhaustion. I carefully retyped the password, hitting the keys with deliberate precision. I hit enter. Again, the red text glared back at me. "Incorrect password. Please try again or contact your branch administrator." A cold, sinking sensation began to spread through my chest. I clicked on the password recovery option, entering my personal email address to receive a reset link. The screen refreshed, displaying a new, far more terrifying message. "This email address is no longer associated with this account." I sat back in the wooden chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen. The harsh reality of the situation washed over me like a wave of freezing water. The lie was not just about the nursing home. It was about everything. Bradley had completely severed my access. The joint account was no longer joint. My life savings, every single dollar I had bled for on those construction sites, was entirely under his control. I was permanently locked out of my own life and left with absolutely nothing but the impending truth. The betrayal was absolute, cold, and utterly merciless in its execution. I closed the heavy laptop. The click of the casing sounded like a gunshot in the room. I sat in darkness, letting the cold reality settle into my bones. Bradley had taken everything. My life savings, my absolute trust. He had completely erased my financial existence while smiling in my face. The calculation required to log in and change passwords on an account. Holding a father's entire life's work was terrifying. It was the act of a sociopath, not the son I had raised. I knew I could not simply confront him. Confrontation without ammunition was a fool's game. If I demanded answers, he would deny it, or use my anger to justify his claim that I was losing my mind. I needed to move in the shadows. I needed a weapon. I stood up and walked quietly to the door. I turned the handle, making sure the latch made no sound. I slipped out into the hallway. The house was quiet. I crept past the master bedroom where my son and his treacherous wife were sleeping soundly, dreaming of their stolen fortune. I moved down the grand staircase, avoiding the steps I knew would creak. I bypassed the kitchen and opened the door leading down to the basement. The basement was a cold, concrete expanse Bradley used for storage. It was freezing down here, a contrast to the plush environment upstairs. I walked to a stack of cardboard boxes in the far corner. Beneath them, hidden out of sight, was an old dented metal toolbox I had brought from my construction days. I popped the rusted latches and opened the lid. Inside, resting beneath a pile of wrenches, was a prepaid burner phone. I purchased it months ago purely on instinct when Bradley started acting evasive about his finances. I never thought I would need it. I held the plastic device and pressed the power button. The screen glowed, casting a harsh blue light over my face. I punched in a number from memory. It belonged to Victoria Lawson. 20 years ago, Victoria was an ambitious junior attorney driving a sleek sedan way too fast near a commercial construction site I managed. A cement truck blew a tire, swerved, and crushed the back half of her car, pinning it against a concrete barrier. The engine caught fire immediately. While everyone else stood panicking, I grabbed a steel crowbar, sprinted into the flames, and shattered her window. I dragged her out of the burning wreckage seconds before the gas tank exploded. She suffered minor burns and a broken collarbone, but she survived. I spent 2 weeks in the burn unit recovering from fire damage to my arms and chest. When Victoria visited me in the hospital, she held my bandaged hand and looked me dead in the eye. She told me that if I ever needed anything in this world, all I had to do was call her private line. Today, Victoria Lawson was not a junior attorney. She was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in Chicago. She was a shark who destroyed fraudulent executives for a living. She was exactly the monster I needed on my side. I listened to the phone ring. It was 2:30 in the morning. I knew I was waking her up, but this could not wait. On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. A groggy voice answered. This had better be an emergency. Victoria, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. It is Richard Caldwell. The line went dead for 3 full seconds. The irritation in her voice vanished, replaced by a sudden razor-sharp alertness. Richard, she breathed. It has been a long time. Are you all right? Are you in trouble? I am standing in the basement of my son's house, I told her. I need you to honor that favor you promised me 20 years ago. I need a corporate predator right now, and I need you to move faster than you have ever moved in your life. Tell me exactly what you need, she replied without hesitation. I leaned against the cold concrete wall. My son Bradley has locked me out of our joint banking accounts. He has seized control of my $400,000 life savings. He and his wife are secretly planning to forcefully commit me to a low-income state-funded nursing facility by tomorrow morning. They believe they have outsmarted a clueless old man. I need you to initiate a quiet forensic probe immediately. I need you to pull the official property deeds, the title history, and any financial encumbrances tied to this Lincoln Park address. I need to know exactly what he has done with my money and my house. I also need to know the operational status of his tech firm, because I suspect he is drowning in toxic debt. You must do this without alerting his banks or triggering any automated security warnings. Victoria exhaled sharply. Richard, I am pulling up my secure terminal right now. Give me the exact address and his full legal name. I gave her the information. The sound of rapid typing echoed through the phone speaker. If he has locked you out of the accounts, we have a severe case of elder financial abuse, she stated, her voice dropping into a lethal professional register. I will have a team of forensic accountants rip his digital life apart before the sun comes up. I will call you the absolute second I find the paper trail. Do not confront him. Do not let him know you suspect anything. Play the frail old man until I give you the weapon to destroy him. I will be waiting, I said. I hung up the phone and slipped it into my pocket. I made my way back upstairs, my muscles aching from the cold and the tension. I crept back into the guest room and locked the door behind me. I lay down, staring at the ceiling. The psychological torment of the next few hours was agonizing. When I closed my eyes, I saw Bradley's smug face. I heard Megan's cruel laughter. I thought about the sheer audacity of their plan: to take my money, sell my roof, and abandon me to rot in a sterile hallway. The betrayal burned like battery acid in my veins, but I channeled that pain. I used it to sharpen my focus. I watched the clock slowly tick forward. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. The sky outside the window began to turn a bruised shade of violet. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the phone vibrated against my leg. I pulled it out and answered, bringing the speaker to my ear. "Victoria," I whispered. "Are you there?" Richard, her voice came through the line. It was chillingly grave, carrying a weight that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I found the paper trail. I found exactly what your son has been hiding." "What is it?" I asked, bracing for the impact. I heard her shuffle a thick stack of freshly printed papers. "Richard, tell me you did not sign a title transfer last month, did you?" "I did not sign anything, Victoria," I answered, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. My hands gripped the edges of the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. "What exactly are you looking at?" I heard the rustle of paper through the receiver. Victoria let out a long, measured breath. "Richard, someone executed a highly sophisticated title transfer 32 days ago. It bears your signature. It was notarized by a third party and filed digitally with the clerk. But that is not even the worst part. The transfer was essentially a maneuver to subordinate your ownership stake. It paved the way for a massive home equity line of credit." "How much?" I asked. My chest tightened as I waited for the answer. $1 million, Victoria stated plainly. "Your son maxed out the equity on the Lincoln Park house. He leveraged every single cent of value, including the $400,000 you put down. The loan was approved, and the funds were completely drained from the account within 48 hours of the closing date." I stood up from the chair, my mind racing through the sheer mechanics of the betrayal. Bradley had not just locked me out of our joint savings. He had actively and maliciously forged my signature to steal $1 million. He had turned the very roof over our heads into a massive, ticking time bomb. "Where is the money now?" I asked, trying to keep the mounting fury out of my tone. "That is where the situation shifts from simple greed to absolute desperation," Victoria explained. "The initial draw was transferred into a series of limited liability companies that are currently masking the final destination. My forensic team is already working on piercing that corporate veil, but it will take a little time to trace the exact routing numbers. However, what I can see right now is the repayment history on that $1 million loan. Or rather, the complete lack of it." "What do you mean, lack of it?" "The bank has not received a single monthly payment, Richard. Not a dime. They are 3 months past due. The lender has already issued the final default notices. If they do not receive a massive lump sum payment to bring the account current, the bank is going to initiate formal foreclosure proceedings in exactly 14 days. 14 days. The reality of those words hit me like a physical blow. Bradley was not just an arrogant, greedy son looking to cash out his old man today. He was a drowning man. You do not forge federal lending documents and steal $1 million from your own father just to buy a house in Aspen. You do it because you owe someone a massive amount of money and they are threatening to break your legs. The puzzle pieces were finally starting to fall into place. The supposed business struggles he mentioned were real, but they were not just market fluctuations. He was hiding a catastrophic failure. "Victoria, I need to know exactly where that $1 million went," I said, my voice sharp and entirely devoid of the frail old man persona I had been wearing. If Bradley is 3 months behind on $1 million loan, he is desperate. And desperate men make sloppy mistakes. But I cannot do this from behind a locked door with empty pockets. He has frozen my access to all my liquid assets. I cannot even buy a cup of coffee without him seeing the transaction on the shared credit card statement. "I need capital to move off the grid." "Tell me what you need," Victoria replied instantly. Her tone was purely transactional, the sound of a legal shark smelling blood in the water. "I need $10,000 in cash," I told her. "Small bills untraceable. I need it by 9 o'clock this morning. I am going to buy all the tools I need to dismantle his entire operation from the inside out. I am going to find out exactly what kind of hell he has dragged my family into before I bring the hammer down on him." "Consider it done," she said. "I will have a courier drop a sealed package in the locker at the bus terminal downtown. I will text you the access code in 10 minutes. Richard listened to me carefully. "Your son is backed into a dangerous corner. If he is facing foreclosure and potentially federal prison for bank fraud, he will do absolutely anything to protect himself. He thinks you are a docile old fool who is going to quietly step onto a bus to a nursing home tomorrow. Do not break character. Do not let him see the anger. Let him keep thinking he is the smartest person in the room until the very second we lock the handcuffs around his wrists. I will play my part perfectly," I assured her. "Just get me that cash." I ended the call and deleted the record from the burner phone. I walked over to the small window in the guest room and pulled the curtain back just an inch. The sky was beginning to lighten, shifting from dark purple to a pale, icy gray. The affluent neighborhood was waking up oblivious to the absolute rot festering inside this pristine house. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously preparing my appearance. I rubbed a damp towel over my face to make my skin look pale and tired. I chose my most worn-out flannel shirt and a pair of faded corduroy trousers. I practiced the slow, deliberate shuffle I would use when I walked down the grand staircase. I had to embody the pathetic, useless burden they believed me to be. At exactly 8 in the morning, I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing. I moved to the window and peered through the narrow gap in the blinds. Bradley was striding confidently down the paved driveway. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee in one hand and his sleek leather briefcase in the other. He pressed a button on his key fob, and the headlights of his black Porsche Panamera flashed in the crisp morning air. He looked so incredibly self-assured. He looked like a man who had successfully conquered the world. He was driving a luxury sports car while secretly balancing on the very edge of a spectacular financial cliff. He genuinely believed his problems were solved. He believed he had successfully discarded his own father to absorb the blow of his catastrophic failures. I watched as he slid into the driver's seat, the powerful engine roaring to life and echoing down the quiet suburban street. He quickly backed out of the driveway and sped off toward the financial district. He was completely unaware that the frail, clueless old man he left behind was not packing a bag for a nursing home. He was unaware that the predator he thought he had buried was actually standing right inside his house, actively preparing to hunt him down. I waited until the house fell completely silent. Bradley had rushed off to his firm under the guise of saving his struggling business. Megan had flitted around the kitchen in her expensive athletic wear, casually reminding me that the transport van for the Shady Pines tour would arrive at 10 o'clock sharp. I nodded and smiled, sipping my black coffee, playing the role of the obedient broken elder to perfection. She kissed my cheek with a sickening sweetness, grabbed her car keys, and announced she was heading to her private yoga class. She told me to be ready and waiting on the porch. The moment the heavy garage door groaned shut and her white SUV disappeared down the street, my fragile demeanor evaporated. I walked directly to the front door and locked the deadbolt. I checked my pocket, feeling the thick envelope of untraceable cash Victoria had arranged for me. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning. I had less than 90 minutes before Megan returned to ensure I was loaded onto that wretched transport van. I walked to the back door and unlatched the sliding glass pane. 10 minutes later, a rusty, unmarked work van pulled into the alley behind the property. A man stepped out carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. His name was Victor. He was a contact Victoria had recommended, a man who specialized in opening very expensive things without leaving a single trace and without asking any questions. I handed him an envelope containing $2,000 in crisp $100 bills. He counted it with a flick of his thumb, nodded silently, and followed me upstairs. We walked past my small guest room and stood before the solid mahogany door of Bradley's home office. My son always kept it locked. He claimed it was to protect sensitive corporate documents from the cleaning staff. Now I knew it was to protect his criminal enterprise from me. Victor examined the digital keypad on the door. He bypassed the electronic lock in less than 3 minutes, using a handheld cloning device. The heavy door clicked open. I stepped into the room. The private sanctuary smelled faintly of expensive cologne and imported leather. Behind the massive oak desk, integrated seamlessly into the custom-built wall cabinetry, was a brushed steel biometric safe. It was a top-of-the-line model requiring a fingerprint and a complex numerical code. I pointed directly to it. Victor set his heavy canvas bag on the floor and pulled out a small drill and a tangled mess of wires connected to a diagnostic tablet. He did not say a word. He simply went to work. I stood by the window watching the street below. My heart hammered a relentless rhythm against my ribs. Every passing car made my muscles tighten. The clock on the wall mocked me. It was already 9:15. Megan's yoga class was scheduled to end at 9:30. She would be pulling into the driveway any minute to make sure her disposal plan went off without a hitch. Victor was sweating slightly. The safe was proving more stubborn than anticipated. I paced the length of the expensive Persian rug, my mind racing through the sheer audacity of my son's betrayal. He had stolen my equity to fund whatever was hiding behind that steel door. At exactly 9:28, a sharp mechanical click echoed through the quiet office. Victor stepped back, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He packed his tools into the canvas bag, gave me a single curt nod, and slipped out of the room, heading straight for the back alley. I was completely alone in the room. I stepped up to the wall cabinet and pulled the heavy steel door open. The inside of the safe was meticulously organized. Stacked neatly on the bottom shelf were thick bundles of cash, easily $50,000 in unmarked bills. A normal man might have grabbed the money and run. But I was not a normal man, and I was not looking for petty cash. I was looking for the weapon that would dismantle my son's entire life. I reached past the bundles of currency and felt around the back of the steel enclosure. My fingers brushed against a false panel. I pressed the edge and it popped loose. Hidden in the dark recess was a small black leather-bound ledger and a cheap disposable burner phone. I pulled the ledger into the light. My calloused hands shook slightly as I flipped open the thick parchment cover. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, dates, and routing codes written in Bradley's precise, familiar handwriting. It was not a record of a struggling technology firm. It was a meticulously detailed map of a massive money laundering operation. I traced the columns with my index finger. Massive wire transfers were listed day after day. $200,000 routed to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. $500,000 funneled through a dummy consulting contract. And then I saw the destination accounts. They were not legitimate vendors. They were offshore betting syndicates. The names of notorious underground sports gambling operations were scribbled in the margins next to staggering negative balances. Bradley had not just borrowed money, he had gambled away millions. He was bleeding his own company dry to cover catastrophic losses in the criminal underworld. The $1 million he had stolen by forging my signature on the home equity line of credit was logged right there on page 42. It was noted as a desperate stopgap payment to an enforcer just to keep his legs from being broken. The sheer scale of his reckless stupidity was breathtaking. He had mortgaged my life to pay off criminals. I stared at the burner phone sitting next to the ledger. This was the lifeline he used to communicate with the monsters he owed. I pulled my own phone from my pocket and took high-resolution photographs of every single page in the black book. I made sure the lighting was perfect, capturing the offshore account numbers, the dates, and the forged loan details. I captured the absolute ruin of his corporate career in digital focus. I slipped the ledger and the burner phone back into the hidden compartment and pushed the false panel into place. I closed the heavy steel door of the biometric safe, listening to the locking mechanism engage with a solid thud. It looked completely untouched. I checked the wall clock. It was 9:35. The silence of the house was suddenly shattered by the mechanical grinding of the automatic garage door opening below. The low hum of Megan's luxury sport vehicle vibrated through the floorboards. She was home far too early. My chest tightened, seizing my breath. I had the photographic evidence of his financial crimes, but I still needed to hear the conversations. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the 2 micro-audio transmitters Victoria had provided with the cash. I had to plant them and make it out of this locked office before Megan walked up the stairs to check on her clueless old father. The heavy vibration of the garage door mechanism sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight into my veins. I had exactly seconds to act before Megan stepped into the main house and realized I was not safely tucked away in my designated guest room. I looked down at the 2 small black discs resting in my calloused palm. Victoria had assured me these micro-audio transmitters were military-grade, capable of picking up a whisper from 30 feet away. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the sharp flare of pain in my aging joints. I slid under Bradley's massive mahogany desk. I ran my fingers along the underside, feeling for the hollow space behind the center drawer, where the wood met the metal frame. It was a blind spot, completely hidden from any casual glance. I peeled the adhesive backing off the first transmitter and pressed it firmly against the rough wood. It stuck with a satisfying permanence. I scrambled to my feet and darted to the office door. I slipped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy door shut. The lock engaged with a soft, metallic click just as I heard the heavy fire door connecting the garage to the mudroom swing open downstairs. The sharp, rhythmic clatter of Megan's expensive heels echoed across the Italian tile. She was moving toward the kitchen, humming a cheerful tune. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, my heart hammering wildly. I still held the second transmitter. I knew I needed to plant it inside her vehicle to capture the full scope of their conspiracy. I moved silently down the carpeted back stairs that led directly to the laundry room, bypassing the main kitchen entirely. Through the crack in the door, I could see Megan standing by the marble island, her back turned to me. She was pouring a glass of sparkling water. Her key fob rested carelessly on the edge of the counter. I slipped past the laundry room and stepped into the dimly lit garage. The air was warm and smelled heavily of the expensive leather interior of her white Mercedes SUV. I approached the passenger side. I pulled the handle. The door swung open silently. I dropped to my knees again, sliding my hand deep under the pristine floor mat, feeling through the intricate wiring of the heated seats. I found a flat metal bracket, pressed the second transmitter against it, and held it there for 3 seconds. I closed the car door just as quietly as I had opened it. I retraced my steps, slipping back into the mudroom. I could hear Megan's voice now. She was dialing her phone, placing it on speaker as she moved toward the living room. I stepped out of the shadows and walked with a deliberately slow, heavy shuffle straight into the living area. I grabbed a knitted throw blanket from the edge of the sofa, lay down, and closed my eyes. I slowed my breathing, adopting the steady, rhythmic cadence of a deeply exhausted old man. Seconds later, Megan walked into the room. She did not even bother to lower her voice. She assumed I was either entirely deaf or deeply asleep. She was talking to one of her high society friends, her tone laced with absolute disgust. "I am telling you, Chloe. I am counting the exact seconds until Friday," she complained loudly, pacing back and forth across the rug right in front of me. "This entire week has been an absolute nightmare. I swear the old man smells like a hospital ward and stale mints. It is seeping into the upholstery." I kept my eyes shut, but my jaw clenched involuntarily beneath the blanket. The sheer malice in her voice was breathtaking. She was talking about me as if I were a feral animal that had wandered into her pristine sanctuary. I had bought her that couch. I had paid for the roof over her head. "Chloe, I do not even care how harsh it sounds," Megan continued, letting out an exasperated sigh. "Bradley finally got the papers processed. The transport van for Shady Pines is coming the morning after the party. We are throwing this ridiculous farewell gathering on Friday night, just to keep up appearances for his business partners. We have to make it look like we are doing the honorable thing by transitioning him to an assisted living facility. Once Friday is over, we ship him off, sell this place, and finally start living our actual lives without his dead weight dragging us down. The cruelty of her words washed over me like toxic sludge. She actually thought the farewell party was a clever charade to protect their social standing. She had no idea that I had just spent the last hour documenting the offshore accounts and the massive embezzlement files that would obliterate that very same social standing. I lay there completely motionless, breathing evenly, letting her dig her own grave with every vicious syllable. I listened as she complained about the catering costs for the party, whining about how they had to buy cheap wine for the guests just to save money for their upcoming trip. She spoke for another 20 minutes before wandering back upstairs, leaving me alone in the quiet living room. I opened my eyes and stared at the vaulted ceiling. The grief I had felt for my lost family was entirely gone now. It had been cleanly replaced by a cold, mechanical resolve. They had declared war on me while smiling in my face. I would simply return the favor. The rest of the day passed in an agonizing blur of fake smiles and forced pleasantries. Bradley came home from the office, acting like the perfect, exhausted provider. We sat at the dinner table, sharing a meal paid for by my stolen equity. I nodded along to his fabricated stories about difficult corporate clients, playing the clueless, supportive father to absolute perfection. When the meal finally ended, I pushed my chair back and announced that I had a terrible headache and needed to go to the pharmacy to pick up a stronger painkiller. Bradley barely looked up from his phone, simply waving me off and telling me to drive safely. I grabbed my truck keys and left the house. I did not go to the pharmacy. Instead, I drove 3 blocks away and parked in the dark, empty lot behind a closed grocery store. I turned off the engine and killed the headlights, plunging the cabin of my truck into absolute darkness. The night air was freezing, but I rolled the window down slightly to let the cold keep me sharp. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small black receiver Victoria had provided. I plugged the discreet earpiece into the jack and fitted it snugly into my right ear. I turned the receiver dial to the first frequency. Static hissed softly in my ear, followed by the ambient silence of Bradley's home office. I sat there in the cold, dark truck, waiting patiently in the shadows. Desperate men always work late into the night. The transmitter in Bradley's office clicked on. I listened. A sharp burst of static crackled through the small plastic earpiece, followed immediately by the hollow ambient acoustics of the home office. I adjusted the volume dial on the black receiver resting in my lap, ensuring the audio was perfectly clear. The heavy rhythmic thud of expensive leather shoes, pacing frantically back and forth across the hardwood floor, vibrated through the tiny speaker. Bradley was moving like a trapped animal. I heard the sharp exhalation of his breath, a ragged sound filled with genuine terror. Then came the rapid electronic beeping of numbers being punched into a small digital keypad. He was using the disposable burner phone I had seen hidden inside the biometric safe. The line rang twice before a heavy, rough voice answered. "Dominic." "It is Bradley." My son stammered the words spilling out of his mouth in a panicked rush. "Please do not hang up on me. I know I missed the deadline this afternoon, but I just need a few more days." The voice on the other end was a low, menacing rumble. The man named Dominic did not sound angry. He sounded completely indifferent, which was far more terrifying. "I told you the firm rules. You knew exactly what would happen if you missed the drop, Bradley," the man stated flatly. "My employers are done granting extensions. You are completely out of time." Bradley let out a desperate, high-pitched gasp that sounded utterly pathetic. "Dominic, please, I am begging you," he pleaded, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. "You already took the $1 million I wired last month," Bradley cried out. "That was a massive good faith payment to show you I am serious about clearing this up." Dominic let out a dark, humorless laugh. $1 million was the minimum required amount. That barely covers the interest on the principal, Bradley. You owe the syndicate $2 million more from your disastrous run on the offshore sports books. We allowed you to bet on credit because you showed us the financials for your tech firm. We thought you were a legitimate executive with actual liquid capital. We did not know you were a degenerate fraud who was faking his profit margins to keep his doors open. I swear I have the rest of the capital coming. Bradley practically screamed into the phone. You have to believe me. I already pulled every single cent. I drained the operational funds and the payroll reserves from my own firm to try and win it back on the last series of games, but the spreads completely ruined me. I am telling you, Dominic, if the board of directors requests a financial audit this week, I am facing 30 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate embezzlement. I have literally risked my entire freedom to pay your syndicate back. You have to give me until Monday. I have a guaranteed massive payout coming in 48 hours. Dominic was silent for a long, agonizing moment. Your corporate problems are not my concern, Bradley, he finally replied, his tone colder than the winter air outside my truck window. My concern is retrieving the $2 million you stole from my employers. If that money is not sitting in the designated routing account, by the time the banks open on Monday morning, I am going to send 2 associates to your pristine house in Lincoln Park. They are going to wait in your driveway, and when you walk out, they are going to put you in the trunk of a vehicle. You will never see daylight ever again. Do you understand my terms? I understand, Bradley gasped desperately. But you will have the money, I promise you. I am finalizing the total liquidation of the estate belonging to my father right now. He is completely clueless, Dominic. He is an exhausted old fool who signs whatever I put in front of him. We are throwing a massive farewell party for him this Friday night. It is just a social performance for the neighbors and my business partners to make us look like loving, devoted children. The very next morning, a state medical transport van is coming to permanently relocate him. Once he is locked inside that hospital, he has absolutely no legal rights and zero access to his remaining financial assets. The second the transport van drives away, I am executing a quiet, under-the-table cash sale of the entire Lincoln Park property. Bradley continued laying out the final treacherous details of his scheme. I already found a private investment group willing to buy the house as is. They are bringing a cash check for $2.5 million directly to the closing table on Saturday afternoon. There are no bank appraisals and no standard waiting periods applied. It is a completely clean, off-the-books transaction. I will take the equity cover the remaining balance I owe your syndicate and wire the full $2 million directly into your offshore account before the sun comes up on Monday. Monday morning, Dominic repeated the words hanging heavy in the digital transmission. This is your absolute final warning, Bradley. There are no more excuses and there are no more extensions. If the wire transfer fails to clear, you are a dead man walking. The line went dead with a sharp click. Inside the office, Bradley dropped the burner phone. He began to hyperventilate, taking long, ragged gasps of air. I heard the sudden violent crash of glass shattering against a wall, followed by a low, guttural scream of pure frustration. He was entirely trapped in a nightmare of his own, making a spider caught in a web he had spun himself. The silence slowly returned. I sat perfectly still in the dark cabin of my truck, staring out at the empty grocery store parking lot. A slow, cold smile spread across my aging face. The sheer magnitude of his desperate stupidity was finally laid completely bare for me tonight. He had sacrificed my life to save his own skin from violent underground criminals. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess, discarding me like a useless pawn to protect his king. He had absolutely no idea that I had just captured every single detail of his criminal confession on a secure military-grade audio channel. He had essentially handed me the weapon to destroy him completely. The transmitter in the office picked up the sound of Bradley taking a deep, trembling breath. I heard his heavy footsteps leaving the room. The office transmission abruptly cut out completely. I reached up, preparing to pull the small earpiece from my ear. Suddenly, the receiver in my lap emitted a sharp electronic beep. The small digital screen flashed, switching automatically to the second encrypted frequency. The dead silence was instantly replaced by the steady rumble of a heavy engine and tires moving across wet pavement. The bug I planted inside the Mercedes had just activated. Megan was driving fast down a dark highway in the middle of the night. I heard a low, deep laugh. She was driving, and she was definitely not alone in that moving vehicle right now. The sharp hiss of highway wind filled my ear. I reached down in the dark cabin of my truck and adjusted the frequency dial on the receiver. The static faded into terrifying clarity. The audio transmitter I wedged under the passenger seat of Megan's luxury SUV was picking up every sound with flawless precision. I heard the rhythmic hum of the tires gliding over the asphalt. Then I heard the unmistakable rustle of heavy fabric shifting. It was followed by a soft, breathy laugh. Megan was laughing, but it was not the forced, high-pitched giggle she used at our dinners. This was a dark, throaty sound of pure, unfiltered indulgence. A heavy silence settled over the feed before it was broken by the wet, distinct sound of kissing. My stomach turned instantly. The sharp clink of crystal glasses chimed through the earpiece. Someone had popped a bottle of expensive champagne inside a moving vehicle. "You really should keep your eyes on the road," a male voice murmured. The voice was smooth, deeply resonant, and practically dripping with smug satisfaction. It sent a massive shockwave of adrenaline straight down my spine. I knew that voice. I had heard it countless times standing in my own kitchen, offering me empty platitudes about the stock market. It was Todd. He was Bradley's co-founder, his oldest friend, and his most trusted business partner. They had built their entire technology firm together from the ground up. Todd was the charismatic salesman who charmed the investors, while Bradley managed the financial operations. And now Todd was sitting in the passenger seat of my daughter-in-law's car, drinking champagne, while my son was having a mental breakdown in his home office. "I can drive perfectly fine with one hand, Todd." Megan purred smoothly. Her voice sounded incredibly relaxed, completely devoid of the fabricated stress she had displayed earlier today. "Besides, the highway is completely empty right now. We have plenty of time before we need to head back to the city." I heard the sound of liquid pouring into a glass. Todd let out a low, appreciative hum. "You know, Megan, we are taking a massive risk meeting like this right now." He cautioned, his tone shifting into something slightly more serious. "Bradley is already functioning on a razor-thin edge. If he catches even the slightest hint that we are seeing each other behind his back, he might completely snap. He's already paranoid about the company audits. Are you absolutely certain he does not suspect a single thing about us?" Megan let out another sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly inside my dark truck. "Bradley does not suspect anything, because Bradley is fundamentally incapable of seeing past his own massive ego," she stated flatly. "He is completely consumed by his own desperate panic right now. He thinks he is a brilliant criminal mastermind trying to save our pristine lifestyle from his underground gambling debts. He genuinely believes he is protecting me from the ugly truth. He comes home every single night sweating through his custom suits, pretending he had a hard day at the office. It is actually quite pathetic to watch. He has absolutely no idea that I know everything, Todd. I know exactly what he has done. I know about the missing $2 million. I know about the fraudulent offshore accounts. I even know about the violent loan sharks breathing down his pathetic neck." Todd let out a slow, whistling breath. The audio picked up the sound of him shifting comfortably in the leather seat. "So he is still fully committed to the Friday timeline?" Todd asked. "He is not getting cold feet about selling the property?" Megan scoffed very loudly. "He is far too terrified of Dominic to get cold feet now," she replied. "He is moving forward exactly as we anticipated. He has the private investment group lined up for a quiet cash closing this Saturday afternoon. They are bringing a certified check for $2.5 million directly to the table. He is going to deposit those funds straight into our primary joint checking account before he initiates the wire transfer to pay off his underworld debts. The second that massive cash deposit clears our joint account, I am completely draining it. I am moving every single penny into the secure trust account we established in Geneva. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel. She had discovered her husband's corporate embezzlement and orchestrated a new layer of fraud to steal the money for herself. She and Todd were conspiring to take the house sale funds and vanish, leaving Bradley to face the wrath of a violent criminal syndicate. They were letting my son do all the heavy lifting. We will have to move incredibly fast once the funds clear. Todd warned, his voice tight with anticipation. Bradley will log into the banking portal to send the wire to Dominic on Monday morning. When he sees the joint account has been zeroed out, he is going to realize immediately what happened. He will probably try to call the authorities or freeze the transfer. Megan laughed again, a sound so entirely devoid of basic human empathy it made my blood run cold. Let him try to call the authorities, Todd. What exactly is he going to tell the police? Is he going to confess that his wife stole the money he originally embezzled from his own company to pay off an illegal sports gambling debt? He cannot go to the police because he is already a massive federal criminal. By the time he realizes the money is gone, we will already be on a private flight to Europe. I have the divorce papers fully drafted and sitting in a safety deposit box. I will have my attorney serve them to him on Tuesday morning while we are drinking espresso in Switzerland. Todd clinked his glass against hers. It is a brilliant strategy, he praised her. But what about the old man? Bradley said he was shipping him off to that miserable state-funded nursing facility this weekend. Is the father going to cause a legal problem for us down the road? What if he tries to claim his equity from the house sale? I leaned closer to the receiver, holding my breath, as the ambient highway noise washed over the transmission. Megan's voice dropped into a dark, triumphant whisper. That is honestly the absolute best part of this entire beautiful tragedy, she murmured venomously. Bradley was so blindly desperate for cash that he blatantly forged his own father's signature on the home equity line of credit documents. He created the fraudulent loan entirely on his own. When the massive bank realizes the payments are defaulting, and the feds finally come knocking to investigate the corporate embezzlement, they are going to see a perfect paper trail of fraud leading directly to Bradley. They will immediately lock Bradley up in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and wire fraud, and as for the clueless old fool, he will be permanently locked away, rotting quietly in a bleak Shady Pines hospital bed, completely unable to prove a single thing. The static hissed softly in my ear, replacing the horrific clarity of Megan's cruel laughter. I reached down with a steady hand and powered off the black receiver resting in my lap. I sat in the darkness of the grocery store parking lot, letting the silence wash over my bones. The betrayal I had just uncovered was no longer a simple matter of greed or a misguided son making a terrible business decision. It was a masterpiece of absolute treachery. Bradley was a desperate criminal drowning in the consequences of his own arrogance. Megan was a venomous parasite feeding on his impending destruction. She knew exactly what he was doing, and she was fully prepared to let him take the fall while she drained the drops of his money and fled with his closest friend. They were two serpents trapped in the same pit, each believing they possessed the deadlier bite. For a long time, I simply stared through the cold windshield at the cracked asphalt illuminated by a distant streetlight. I waited patiently for the familiar, suffocating ache of paternal grief to arrive. I waited for the natural instinct to rush in and desperately save my son from the violent loan sharks, or to fiercely warn him about his treacherous wife. I waited for the protective father in me to desperately try and salvage whatever was left of my deeply broken family. But the crippling grief never came. The loyal father, who would have gladly burned the entire world down to protect his boy, died quietly in the freezing cabin of that truck. He was permanently replaced by something entirely different, something cold, relentlessly calculating, and completely devoid of any remaining mercy. I decided right then that I would absolutely not save Bradley from Megan. I would absolutely not save Megan from Bradley. I would not intervene to stop the federal investigators from knocking down his corporate doors, nor would I stop the underground enforcers from collecting their massive debts. I was going to permanently lock them both in a cage of their own making, tightly secure the perimeter, and calmly dropped the lit match. I started the heavy engine and drove slowly out of the dark lot. I did not return to the grand house in Lincoln Park. Instead, I navigated through the quiet nighttime streets toward the glowing downtown financial district. Victoria had sent me a secure, encrypted message instructing me to meet her at a highly private location the following morning. I spent the remainder of the long night in a modest, anonymous motel, paying the clerk in untraceable cash. I desperately needed the physical distance to completely shed the pathetic, shuffling persona I had been forced to wear. At exactly 10 o'clock the next morning, I walked into an exclusive, high-end, bespoke tailor located on the Magnificent Mile. The sophisticated shop smelled intensely of rich mahogany and imported wool. Victoria was already waiting for me, sitting elegantly on a tufted leather sofa and sipping sparkling water. She looked exactly like a ruthless general actively preparing a battlefield map. When I walked through the heavy glass doors, she stood up gracefully and handed me a thick, locked leather portfolio. "I have secured absolutely everything, Richard," she said, her voice ringing with absolute, unwavering authority. "Bradley genuinely thought he had completely erased your financial existence when he drained your joint savings and illegally maxed out the house equity. But he made a catastrophic miscalculation. He was so intensely focused on your liquid cash that he completely failed to uncover the massive commercial real estate trust your late father established in your name decades ago. The exact same trust you instructed my firm to quietly manage all those years ago. It officially matured last month. The current market value of those prime downtown commercial properties is exactly $18 million, and it is completely legally untouchable by your desperate son." I took the heavy leather portfolio, feeling the immense physical weight of the verified documents hidden inside. $18 million. Bradley had foolishly destroyed his entire life and enthusiastically sold his own father to the wolves for a pathetic fraction of what I actually possessed. He had permanently traded a massive, highly secure legacy for a quick, dirty fix to his pathetic gambling debts. I walked directly over to the tailoring counter and dropped 30 crisp $100 bills from Victoria's cash envelope onto the polished glass. The master tailor, an older gentleman with a yellow tape measure draped around his neck, stepped forward with immediate, unquestioning deference. "I need a custom suit," I told him, my voice deeply resonant and commanding. "I need it tailored perfectly to my exact measurements, and I need it finished by tomorrow afternoon. I am attending a very important social event." The profound transformation was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. As the skilled tailor expertly measured my broad shoulders and meticulously adjusted the sharp break of the trousers, I watched the frail, exhausted old man completely vanish inside the tall floor-to-ceiling mirrors. The faded corduroy and the worn flannel shirts were permanently discarded. When I finally stepped into the bright fitting room the next day and slipped on the deep charcoal wool jacket, I did not look like a useless burden waiting to be quietly shipped off to a bleak state medical facility. I looked like a multi-millionaire corporate predator boldly stepping onto an active battlefield. I looked exactly like the man who was about to systematically dismantle my son's entire existence. Victoria stood firmly beside me, looking at my sharp reflection with a crisp, approving nod. "The trap is perfectly set," she murmured, adjusting her designer briefcase. "The federal authorities have been anonymously tipped off about the corporate embezzlement and the fraudulent loan documents. They are aggressively building their criminal case right now." The eager buyer Megan and Bradley blindly lined up for the rapid cash sale of the house is actually an undercover operative securely arranged by my firm. They will be sitting at the closing table on Saturday, fully ready to legally freeze the massive assets the very second Bradley attempts to make the desperate wire transfer. Your son and your treacherous daughter-in-law are walking blindly into a solid concrete wall. I adjusted my dark silk tie and carefully buttoned the tailored jacket. "I am completely ready," I replied simply to her, feeling the truth. Friday morning arrived with a sickening burst of manic energy at the Lincoln Park house. I had returned the night before, slipping quietly back into my pathetic role. The grand property was buzzing with a chaotic, highly superficial joy. Catering vans pulled into the wide driveway, rapidly unloading massive silver chafing dishes and wooden crates of extremely expensive champagne. Delivery workers carried towering, elaborate floral arrangements through the front doors, quickly setting them up around the pristine backyard patio. I stood perfectly still in the quiet, dim shadows of my room, staring at myself in the mirror, smoothly slipping my father's $18 million property deeds deep into the soft, silk breast pocket of my custom-tailored jacket. I was finally ready for this confrontation. The dull roar of 30 affluent voices echoed up the grand staircase. I stood in the absolute silence of my bedroom, listening to the grotesque performance unfolding below. The faint melodic notes of a hired string quartet drifted through the heavy oak door, completely overwhelmed by the sharp clinking of crystal champagne flutes and booming forced laughter. It was exactly 6 o'clock on Friday evening. The farewell party had officially begun. Bradley and Megan had invited their country club friends, his corporate investors, and of course his deeply treacherous business partner Todd. They were all currently downstairs, drinking extremely expensive vintage champagne and eating imported caviar that had been unknowingly purchased with my stolen equity. I could hear Bradley projecting his voice over the crowd, playing the role of the remarkably brave and dutiful son. He was spinning a flawless, tragic narrative about his beloved aging father. He was probably telling the eager audience how heartbroken he was to see my mental faculties decline. He was surely detailing the great personal sacrifice he was making to transition me into a luxury resort-style retirement community. It was a spectacular theatrical production designed to solicit sympathy and completely mask his desperate criminal reality. I turned away from the heavy oak door and looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The frail, broken old man who had shuffled through this house for the past week was completely gone. In his place stood a man forged from cold iron, the bespoke $3,000 charcoal suit draped perfectly across my broad shoulders. The master tailor on the magnificent mile had worked an absolute miracle. The deep, rich wool fabric completely hid the heavy, muscular frame I had built over 40 years of commercial construction. My posture was perfectly straight. My chin was high. The deep lines on my face no longer looked like maps of exhaustion. They looked like scars earned in battle. I smoothed the lapels of the jacket and reached into the breast pocket. My fingers brushed against the thick, folded parchment of the property deeds. $18 million in fully matured commercial real estate rested directly over my heart. I was no longer a confused widower blindly trusting a malicious son. I was a remarkably powerful man, preparing to burn a den of vipers entirely to the ground. My burner phone vibrated twice against my hip. It was the signal from Victoria. She had just pulled into the wide, circular driveway. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with absolute resolve. I unlocked my bedroom door and stepped out into the softly lit hallway. The transition from the quiet sanctuary of the upper floor to the chaotic noise of the lower level felt incredibly surreal. I walked slowly toward the grand staircase, my leather dress shoes making no sound against the thick carpet. As I reached the upper landing, I paused to look down at the sprawling living room. The space was completely transformed. Megan had spared absolutely no expense for her final triumphant performance. A massive floral arrangement dominated the center table. Waitstaff in crisp white shirts circulated seamlessly through the affluent crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with gourmet appetizers. Bradley stood near the massive stone fireplace holding court with 3 older men I recognized as his primary technology investors. He wore a stunning light gray suit holding a glass of amber liquid and smiling with completely manufactured warmth. Across the room, Megan was linking arms with Todd. They were standing dangerously close to each other, sharing a private joke, completely oblivious to the impending destruction rushing toward them. I gripped the polished wooden handrail and took my first deliberate step down the grand staircase. I did not shuffle. I did not hunch my shoulders or look down at my feet. I moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of an apex predator stepping into an enclosed arena. My heavy leather shoes struck the hardwood stairs with a sharp, commanding rhythm. The sound was incredibly distinct, cutting directly through the melodic classical music and the low hum of wealthy conversation. One of the waitstaff looked up toward the stairs and abruptly stopped moving. A wealthy woman dripping in expensive diamonds followed his gaze and let out a soft, surprised gasp. The reaction spread across the crowded room like a fast-moving physical wave. The booming laughter completely faded. The string quartet suddenly faltered and stopped playing as the musicians noticed the profound shift in the atmosphere. Within 15 seconds, an absolute deafening silence fell over the massive living room. 30 pairs of eyes stared up at the staircase, completely mesmerized by the shocking visual contradiction before them. Bradley stopped mid-sentence. His confident smile completely dissolved, leaving his face a pale, blank mask of total confusion. He stared up at me, his eyes darting frantically over the sharp lines of my bespoke suit and my commanding posture. This was absolutely not the broken, shuffling old man he had booked a transport van for. Megan dropped her hand from Todd's arm. Her mouth fell open slightly as she looked at my transformed appearance. The narrative they had carefully constructed for this entire crowd was instantly shattered by the simple, powerful reality of my physical presence. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase and stepped directly onto the main floor. The guests instinctively parted, forming a wide, clear path through the very center of the room. At that exact moment, the heavy front double doors swung open. Victoria Lawson walked into the grand foyer. She looked absolutely devastating in a tailored black suit carrying her signature leather briefcase. She moved with ruthless corporate efficiency, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the marble tile. She ignored the 30 wealthy guests, completely bypassing them to stand directly at my right shoulder. She looked incredibly lethal. Bradley swallowed hard, stepping nervously forward from the fireplace. "Dad?" He stammered, his voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant boom. "What exactly are you wearing? What is going on here? And who is this woman?" I looked directly into his panicked eyes, letting the cold, absolute silence of the room stretch out for an agonizing moment. I wanted him to feel the profound shift in power. I wanted him to understand on a primal level that he had completely lost control of the board. "This is Victoria Lawson." I stated, my voice deep and incredibly calm, projecting clearly to the very back of the silent room. "She is my personal financial advisor. I asked her to join us this evening because I realized we had some extremely important business to conclude before I depart." Megan stepped quickly to Bradley's side, her face tight with a sudden, desperate panic. She knew instantly her masterful escape plan was in terrible jeopardy. "Mr. Montgomery," she began, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to maintain her sweet, caring daughter-in-law persona. "We did not know you were inviting outside guests. This is supposed to be a private family celebration. A quiet goodbye before your transition tomorrow." I clinked a silver spoon against a crystal glass. "I have an announcement to make before I leave." The crystal rang with a high, clear note hanging in the tense air. 30 faces stared back at me, perfectly frozen in shock and confusion. I let my eyes wander over the crowd, taking in the expensive suits, glittering jewelry, and the shallow, performative sympathy they had all brought to my supposed farewell party. Bradley stood rigid near the fireplace. His jaw was tight, and I could see the faint sheen of nervous sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Megan remained beside him, her manicured hands clutching a champagne flute so tightly I thought the stem might snap. I took a slow, measured breath. For the past week, I have walked through this house as a ghost. I began, my voice steady and devoid of the weak tremor I had faked. I have allowed my son and his wife to paint a tragic portrait of a grieving widower whose mind is slipping away, a man who needs to be nudged into a state facility for his own good. But before I pack my bags, I want to speak about the man who taught me what real strength is. My father was not a man of high society or corporate boardrooms. He built his life with calloused hands and a fractured back working commercial construction sites until his body practically gave out. He bled for every dollar he earned. He taught me that loyalty is not measured in words, but in actions. He also taught me to always secure the foundation before you build the house. For decades, I believed I understood exactly what he meant. But only recently did I discover the true depth of his foresight. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the extremely quiet room. I turned, looking directly into Bradley's wide, panicked eyes. My son believed my entire financial existence was tied up in a modest $400,000 nest egg. I continued keeping my gaze locked onto him. He believed that was the absolute ceiling of my worth. But my father was an incredibly shrewd man who made quiet off-the-grid investments long before the modern digital age. He secured vast tracts of land and placed them into a highly secure commercial trust. That trust was specifically designed to mature upon a specific date completely outside the view of greedy hands or prying digital eyes. I reached into the breast pocket of my bespoke jacket and slowly pulled out the thick, folded parchment deeds. Victoria Lawson stepped to my side, standing like a perfectly armed sentinel. I unfolded the heavy documents, holding them up so the formal legal seals caught the light of the crystal chandelier. My father left me 3 massive commercial farms spanning hundreds of acres in Iowa and a sprawling private coastal estate in Monterey. I announced, my voice echoing cleanly across the vaulted ceiling. The trust officially matured 30 days ago. I am now the sole legal owner of a diversified real estate portfolio currently valued at a staggering $18 million. The reaction was absolutely visceral. A gasp rippled through the affluent crowd of investors and country club friends. The sheer magnitude of the number hit the room like a physical shockwave. $18 million. It was a sum of money that commanded instant, terrifying respect from the exact type of people who worshipped wealth above all else. Whispers immediately broke out among Bradley's business partners. They leaned into each other, casting bewildered glances from my sharp-tailored suit to the official documents in my hand. But the most spectacular transformation happened on the faces of my son and daughter-in-law. The naked, unadulterated greed that washed over them was a masterclass in human depravity. The nervous panic that had gripped Bradley only moments before completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a predatory hunger so intense it was almost blinding. Megan dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the Italian tile floor, spilling expensive alcohol everywhere, but she did not even flinch. Her wide eyes were entirely fixated on the folded parchment in my hands. The desperate criminal nightmare they were facing, the loan sharks. The massive embezzlement, the ticking clock of foreclosure, seemed to evaporate from their minds. In their twisted, arrogant reality, they simply saw an $18 million lifeline freely handed to them by the clueless old fool they were about to discard. Megan was the first to break the heavy silence. She abandoned Todd and rushed aggressively across the center of the room, her expensive heels clicking frantically. Her face contorted into an utterly grotesque mask of overwhelming joy and manufactured relief. She threw her arms out, reaching for me with a sudden, suffocating desperation. Genuine tears sprang to her eyes, fueled entirely by the massive sum of money I had just announced. "Oh my God, Dad," she gasped, her voice trembling with theatrical emotion as she grabbed my forearm in a tight, vicious grip. "That means you do not have to go. You do not have to leave us tomorrow. You can just stay right here with us forever. We can completely upgrade the house. We can hire private and home nursing staff round the clock. You never have to worry about a single thing ever again. We love you so incredibly much." Bradley was right behind her, completely abandoning his rigid posture. He sprinted forward, adopting the role of the remarkably devoted and loving son. He placed a heavy, seemingly affectionate hand firmly onto my left shoulder, squeezing it with an incredibly desperate intensity. "We were so completely heartbroken to see you go, Dad." Bradley lied, his voice thick with a deeply sickening sincerity. "This is an absolute miracle. This is a tremendous blessing for our family. You have worked so incredibly hard your entire life, and you deserve to enjoy this wealth. Let me help you properly manage that massive portfolio. I can seamlessly integrate it into our firm's asset management division to ensure it grows safely. We can protect your legacy together as a family. I stood perfectly still in the center of the lavish room, the suffocating weight of their physical touch crawling across my skin like a venomous disease. I looked down at Megan's desperate, grasping fingers, clutching the sleeve of my $3,000 jacket. I looked up at Bradley's incredibly smug, deeply arrogant face. He truly believed he had won. He truly believed I was blind to the deep, rotting decay hiding right beneath his expensive tailored suit. He believed he was going to take my father's $18 million and smoothly pay off his violent underground gambling debts without me ever knowing the difference. I let the silence hang for 3 full seconds, allowing the entire crowd to witness the absolute peak of their nauseating performance. I looked directly at my son's hand resting heavily on my shoulder. I slowly raised my own right arm and directly slapped his hand away with a sharp, violent crack that echoed fiercely through the completely silent room. "I am leaving," I stated, my voice dropping into a dark, lethal register. "But you two are coming with me straight to the gutter." The entire room seemed to collectively hold its breath. The suffocating silence was incredibly thick and exceptionally heavy, completely replacing the highly manufactured joy that had filled the grand living space only moments before. It was a silence so physically profound that I could clearly hear the nervous, ragged breathing of the wealthy guests standing nearest to me. The sharp metallic sound of a heavy brass zipper moving smoothly along its track suddenly cut through the heavy air. Victoria stepped forward from my right shoulder. She did not rush her precise movements. She moved with the calculated, predatory grace of an executioner who had just been given the final, irrevocable order to proceed. She unzipped the thick black leather folio she had been carrying under her arm and reached deeply inside. Her expression remained a perfectly blank mask of absolute corporate indifference as she slowly withdrew a thick, substantial stack of high-resolution, heavily magnified financial documents. With a swift, incredibly sharp flick of her wrist, Victoria tossed the thick stack directly onto the center of the massive mahogany dining table. The heavy papers scattered violently across the polished wood, sliding rapidly over the imported linen runner, and coming to rest dangerously close to the silver chafing dishes and the extravagant floral arrangements. The bold black ink of the official banking seals and the stark red stamps of the forensic commercial auditors were clearly visible to anyone standing within 10 feet of the table. I watched as the eyes of Bradley's sophisticated corporate investors immediately dropped to the table, drawn instantly by the undeniable gravity of official financial letterhead. They recognized the distinctive formatting of bank foreclosure notices and formal audit demands. I did not look down at the scattered papers. I kept my gaze securely and permanently fastened onto my son. His face had completely drained of all color, transforming rapidly into an ashen, sickly gray mask of absolute terror. His mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a desperate fish pulled violently from the water and tossed onto the dry dock. "You truly thought I was completely blind to your massive operations," I said, my voice echoing like a physical blow against the vaulted ceiling of the vast space. I took a slow, highly deliberate step forward, forcing him to instinctively and physically shrink back toward the heavy stone fireplace. "You thought you could simply medicate me heavily, sedate me, and quietly shove me into a state-funded hospital ward while you frantically covered your tracks. You believed you were a brilliant mastermind, maneuvering pieces on a chessboard, completely unaware that you were fundamentally incompetent. But you left an incredibly messy, highly visible trail of destruction right behind you." I pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at the scattered documents resting heavily on the dining table. "You forged my signature, Bradley. You stole my $400,000 equity to pay off a loan shark because you embezzled $2 million from your own company." The words hung in the air, incredibly toxic and absolutely devastating. The physical reaction from my son was instantaneous and completely pathetic. Bradley let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp that sounded completely inhuman. It was the sound of a man watching the very foundation of his life crumble completely into ash. He instinctively scrambled backward, desperately trying to put physical distance between himself and the undeniable truth laying bare on the table. His polished leather shoe violently caught the thick edge of an expensive Persian rug. He lost his balance completely, his arms flailing wildly in the air as he stumbled backward, entirely out of control. His shoulder slammed violently into a tall, tiered silver serving tray loaded with dozens of delicate crystal champagne flutes. The entire metal structure collapsed with a deafening, catastrophic crash. Shattered glass exploded aggressively across the Italian tile floor, sending a spray of incredibly expensive vintage champagne raining heavily down over the immaculate shoes of his wealthy guests. The sharp sound of breaking crystal echoed terribly through the house, but nobody even flinched or moved away. The true damage was entirely focused on the revelation of his profound financial crimes. I watched the three older men standing near the fireplace, the primary investors who had just been laughing and drinking with him moments before. The horrifying realization of my words crashed into their minds with the brutal, unstoppable force of a runaway freight train. Embezzlement. $2 million. The color completely vanished from their faces as they suddenly understood that the highly profitable technology firm they had blindly poured their fortunes into was nothing more than a hollow, bleeding shell. One of the older men, a tall executive with silver hair, immediately cursed out loud under his breath and aggressively plunged his hand deeply into his tailored jacket pocket. He pulled out his mobile phone, his fingers shaking wildly as he desperately began dialing his corporate legal team to freeze his exposed assets. The other sophisticated investors instantly followed suit, a rapid wave of sheer, terrifying panic washing heavily over them as they realized their money was completely gone. They began shouting into their devices, demanding immediate forensic audits and asset freezes, entirely ignoring the shattered glass around their feet. The party had instantly transformed into a chaotic crime scene. The carefully constructed, pristine facade of the farewell party was utterly annihilated. Bradley lay trembling on the floor amid the broken crystal and spilled alcohol, completely incapable of defending himself against the absolute truth. He was a broken shell of a man, stripped of his arrogance and laid bare before his peers. But my intense focus swiftly shifted away from the broken man bleeding on the tile. I looked sharply across the room toward the grand archway leading directly into the designer kitchen. Megan had been standing incredibly close to Todd, her secret partner in this secondary layer of massive betrayal. But the second the horrifying words wire fraud and embezzlement left my lips, her primal venomous survival instincts violently kicked in. She aggressively dropped Todd's arm as if his skin had suddenly caught fire. She scrambled quickly away from him, creating a vast physical distance between herself and the men going down with the sinking ship. She pressed her manicured hands tightly over her mouth, her eyes incredibly wide. She was executing a masterful, deeply calculated pivot in real time. She was completely abandoning the husband she had plotted to ruthlessly rob, desperately trying to salvage her own fragile innocence before the federal authorities inevitably arrived. Tears began to stream rapidly down her perfectly contoured cheeks. It was a spectacular, almost terrifying display of absolute emotional manipulation. She let out a loud, theatrical sob that somehow managed to pierce directly through the chaotic, frantic murmurs of the panicked investors. I didn't know she cried out, her voice trembling with the perfect, highly practiced pitch of a devastated, entirely clueless wife. "Oh my God. Bradley, how could you? How could you do this to your own family?" She took a dramatic, shuddering step toward me violently, clasping her hands together in a desperate, deeply fake plea for mercy. "Dad, I swear I had no idea." I turned very slowly to face her. I looked down at her tear-streaked face. She was trembling, her lower lip quivering, with a calculated display of pure terror. She believed she could pivot away from the wreckage of her husband and latch onto whatever safety she could manipulate out of me. She thought I was still the blind, forgiving father she had mocked. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or offer her an ounce of the reaction she was trying to provoke. Instead, I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small black remote. I held it up, allowing the light to catch its smooth surface. Bradley was groaning on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass, but his eyes darted upward, tracking my hand. Megan stopped sobbing, staring blankly at the device. I had paid for the renovation of this house 3 years ago. I authorized the installation of the integrated surround sound system that connected every room through hidden speakers. I spent yesterday afternoon bypassing their digital security codes and linking my audio receiver directly to the master control hub. With a single motion, I pressed the playback button. A sharp click echoed from above, followed instantly by a heavy hum of static that poured from every speaker in the massive living room. The string quartet had already fled, leaving nothing but the suffocating silence of the panicked crowd. Then the pristine audio began to play. The sound of a vehicle engine rumbling down a dark highway filled the air. It was followed by a throaty laugh. Megan's laugh. It was completely unfiltered and so intimately familiar that several of her wealthy friends recoiled in shock. The wet sound of kissing echoed terribly from the vaulted ceiling, followed by the sharp clink of crystal champagne glasses. "You really should keep your eyes on the road," a smooth, deeply resonant male voice murmured through the speakers. A massive collective gasp violently ripped through the crowded room. Every head snapped instantly toward Todd. The charismatic business partner was standing frozen near the patio doors, his handsome face rapidly draining of all color. He looked exactly like a guilty man who had just stepped onto a live landmine. "I can drive perfectly fine with one hand." Todd Megan's recorded voice purred, bouncing off the walls with terrifying clarity. Bradley pushed himself up onto his bleeding knees, his hands gripping the edges of a broken silver tray. His breath hitched as the impossible reality of the audio recording crashed heavily onto his shoulders. He stared at his wife and his oldest friend, trying to comprehend the betrayal. The digital recording continued mercilessly, stripping away every layer of their constructed lies. The crowd stood completely paralyzed, trapped in absolute morbid fascination. They listened with wide, horrified eyes as Todd cautioned Megan about Bradley's paranoid mental state. They listened as Megan laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that exposed her rotten core. "He thinks he is a brilliant criminal mastermind, trying to save our lifestyle from his underground gambling debts," the recorded. Megan stated, her voice dripping with venomous contempt. "He genuinely believes he is protecting me. He has no idea that I know everything, Todd. I know about the missing $2 million. I know about the fraudulent offshore accounts. I know about the violent loan sharks breathing down his pathetic neck." The corporate investors standing near the fireplace began cursing out loud, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of high society decorum. They were actively listening to the undeniable confirmation of their lost fortunes. But the audio drop was far from over. "The second that massive cash deposit clears our joint account, I am completely draining it," the recording boomed, filling every corner of the house with undeniable treachery. "I am moving every single penny into the secure trust account we established in Geneva." Megan let out a high-pitched scream in the center of the living room. She lunged forward desperately, reaching for the small black remote in my hand. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice breaking into a ragged, hysterical sob. "Turn it off, right now! You are ruining my entire life!" Victoria smoothly intercepted her, casually stepping forward and driving the heavy corner of her leather briefcase directly into Megan's sternum. The blow was swift and perfectly calculated. Megan collapsed backward onto the Persian rug, gasping wildly for air, her flawless reputation completely atomized in front of every person she wanted to impress. "Let him try to call the authorities." Todd, the recorded audio continued, weaving a permanent noose around their necks. What exactly is he going to tell the police? Is he going to confess that his wife stole the money he originally embezzled to pay off an illegal sports gambling debt? By the time he realizes the money is gone, we will already be on a private flight to Europe. I have the divorce papers fully drafted and sitting in a safety deposit box. That was the exact moment the final thread of Bradley's sanity permanently snapped. He let out a guttural, animalistic roar of pure, unrestrained agony. He locked his wild, bloodshot eyes directly onto Todd. Todd realized instantly that he was doomed. The charismatic salesman dropped his champagne glass and spun around, making a desperate sprint toward the heavy glass patio doors. He shoved a wealthy socialite out of his way, trying to escape into the dark backyard. Bradley moved with a terrifying, unhinged speed. He launched himself forcefully off the Italian tile floor, ignoring the jagged shards of broken crystal biting deeply into his knees. He lunged directly across the space, vaulting wildly over the heavy wooden coffee table with a reckless momentum. He collided with Todd just inches from the patio doors. The physical force of the tackle sent both men crashing brutally through a towering display of catered appetizers. Bradley straddled his former best friend, pinning him to the hardwood floor. He began swinging his heavy fists in a blind, chaotic frenzy, screaming violently with every blow. Todd threw his arms up frantically, trying to protect his bloody face from the relentless assault. The elegant country club guests began screaming, shoving each other desperately, trying to flee the erupting carnage. The beautiful farewell party had instantly devolved into a chaotic war zone. I stood perfectly still in the center of the vast living room, completely untouched by the violently swirling chaos. I did not raise a hand to stop my son from destroying his treacherous partner. I did not offer a single glance of pity to the hysterical crying woman broken on the floor. I watched the total destruction of their corrupt empire with cold, mechanical satisfaction. They built their pathetic lives on a foundation of lies, greed, and profound betrayal. They eagerly plotted to discard me into a sterile institution. I was simply returning the brutal favor. I casually slipped the small black remote back into the inner pocket of my charcoal suit. Victoria stood perfectly calm at my right shoulder, her dark eyes scanning the bloody brawl with absolute professional indifference. She smoothly reached into her tailored blazer and pulled out her mobile phone. Without a trace of emotion, she calmly dialed 911. The shrill wail of approaching sirens sliced through the chaotic noise of the shattered living room. Bright red and blue lights violently washed across the tall glass patio doors, casting frantic shadows over the struggling men on the floor. 3 heavily armed police officers burst through the grand entryway, their heavy boots crunching loudly over the broken crystal. They shouted sharp, commanding orders, demanding immediate compliance from everyone in the room. 2 officers aggressively lunged forward, seizing Bradley by his tailored shoulders and physically ripping him off the bleeding frame of his former best friend. Todd lay gasping on the ruined Persian rug, his face an absolute mess of dark bruises and swelling tissue. The wealthy country club guests had retreated entirely into the far corners of the house, completely terrified by the sudden explosion of raw violence. The officers slammed Bradley roughly against the stone fireplace, forcefully twisting his arms behind his back and snapping cold metal handcuffs tightly around his wrists. He did not fight back. He simply hung his head, his chest heaving with ragged, exhausted sobs. The lead officer turned his sharp gaze toward me, demanding to know who was pressing formal assault charges for the brutal altercation. I stepped forward smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke charcoal jacket. I looked down at the pathetic, bleeding mess on the floor and felt absolutely nothing. "I will not be pressing any formal assault charges tonight, officer." I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely detached. The physical altercation between those 2 men is entirely their own personal matter. However, there is a much larger legal issue unfolding in this house right now. I gestured cleanly toward Victoria, who was already stepping forward with a fresh stack of highly official legal documents resting securely in her hands. Victoria moved with the absolute lethal precision of a highly trained corporate assassin. She did not raise her voice, but the sheer authority in her tone demanded absolute silence from everyone remaining in the shattered room. She walked directly over to Bradley, who was currently being held against the stone masonry by the 2 officers. She calmly held the crisp white documents directly in front of his tear-streaked face. "You are officially being served with an immediate eviction notice due to verified criminal fraud committed on this property," Victoria announced, her words cutting through the air like a sharpened blade. Bradley let out a hollow, confused whimper staring blindly at the legal papers. Victoria did not pause to allow him to process the catastrophic information. She turned her cold, calculating gaze directly toward Megan, who was still curled miserably on the floor nearby. Because the original home equity line of credit was secured through documented signature forgery and massive corporate embezzlement. This entire property is now legally classified as an active crime scene and a stolen asset, Victoria explained flawlessly. My firm has successfully executed a highly classified judicial order. You have exactly 30 minutes to pack a single bag of personal clothing and permanently vacate these premises. Megan let out a shrill, terrified shriek, desperately shaking her head back and forth. You cannot legally do this to us, she cried out hysterically. We have money in the bank. We have joint accounts. We can hire lawyers to fight you. Victoria offered a small, incredibly dark smile that held absolutely zero warmth. You have absolutely nothing, Megan, she corrected smoothly. An hour ago, federal investigators completely froze every single financial account tied to your names. The joint checking accounts, the offshore shell companies, the hidden trust in Geneva. They are all completely locked and currently being seized by the federal government. Furthermore, Richard's newly matured commercial portfolio is fully shielded inside an ironclad generational trust. You have zero access to his $18 million and zero resources to fight this eviction. Your luxurious criminal lifestyle officially ends tonight. The absolute magnitude of their total destruction finally crashed down upon them completely. The arrogant facade they had proudly worn for years completely shattered, leaving nothing but raw, desperate terror in its wake. Megan scrambled violently across the ruined floor, ignoring the sharp pieces of broken glass digging into her expensive dress. She threw herself directly at my feet, collapsing heavily onto her knees. She grabbed the impeccably tailored fabric of my trousers, sobbing with a pathetic, wild intensity. Dad, please, I am begging you, she wailed, her voice echoing horribly through the silent room. You cannot throw us out into the street. Where are we supposed to go? I have absolutely nothing left. Please show us some mercy. Bradley collapsed against the stone fireplace, weeping openly and uncontrollably like a frightened child. His shoulders shook with massive, pathetic sobs, entirely humiliated in front of his wealthy peers and business investors. He had lost his company, his fortune, his treacherous wife, and his freedom all in a single devastating hour. I looked down at the two sobbing figures, pathetic parasites finally crushed beneath the immense weight of their own monumental greed. I felt absolutely no pity for the monsters who had eagerly planned to discard me in a bleak state facility. I reached down with slow, deliberate precision and physically peeled Megan's trembling fingers completely off the soft fabric of my trousers. I did not utter a single word of comfort or offer a single gesture of forgiveness to the treacherous woman kneeling pathetically before me on the ground. I simply stepped cleanly over her sobbing form, leaving her weeping miserably on the severely stained Persian rug without a second thought. The remaining wealthy guests parted silently, creating a wide, clear path for me as I walked purposefully toward the grand double doors. Victoria followed closely behind me, her sleek leather briefcase snapping shut with a deeply satisfying note of permanent finality. I walked out into the cool evening air, leaving the chaotic ruin of their pathetic lives entirely behind me forever. The heavy oak door slammed shut, echoing loudly across the beautifully manicured front lawn. I climbed up into the familiar, comfortable cabin of my heavy truck, starting the massive engine with a loud, powerful roar that broke the quiet night. I shifted the heavy vehicle into gear and drove slowly down the curving driveway. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the dark, empty road, stretching out far ahead into the beautiful night, perfectly determined to never look back. I absolutely did not check the glowing rearview mirror to watch the bright flashing police lights illuminating their ultimate permanent downfall. The entire weekend passed gracefully, in a state of absolute calculated silence, as I patiently prepared for the final crushing blow to officially land. I rested comfortably in a luxury downtown hotel suite, eagerly watching the local news networks begin to heavily catch wind of the magnificent financial scandal rapidly unfolding in Lincoln Park. The arrogant tech executive and his wife were completely ruined. But the true devastation, the completely inescapable, terrifying reality of their monumental criminal failures, was simply waiting patiently for the early dawn to break over the magnificent city skyline. Monday morning arrived with an incredibly harsh, blinding light. The absolute fallout was finally here. Monday morning arrived with an incredibly harsh, blinding light. The absolute fallout was finally here. At precisely 8 o'clock, a convoy of dark federal vehicles violently swarmed the sleek glass and steel plaza that housed the celebrated technology firm. Dozens of heavily armed agents poured through the revolving doors, moving with swift, tactical precision. They bypassed the panicked receptionists and immediately locked down the entire executive floor. Victoria had anonymously delivered a meticulously organized digital dossier to the Financial Crimes Division 48 hours prior. It contained every forged document, every phantom wire transfer, and a flawless map of the massive corporate embezzlement Bradley had desperately tried to conceal. The authorities did not even need to search for the evidence, because we had systematically handed it directly to them on a silver platter. I sat comfortably in the leather seat of my parked truck across the street, holding a steaming cup of dark coffee, watching the spectacular raid unfold through the tinted windows. Agents rapidly confiscated hard drives, stacked heavy cardboard boxes of financial ledgers onto metal carts, and sealed the perimeter with yellow tape. Less than an hour later, the heavy glass doors slid open, and Bradley emerged. He was no longer the arrogant corporate titan in a custom-tailored suit. He was stripped of his expensive tie, and his hands were secured tightly behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs. Two stern federal agents guided him firmly toward a waiting armored transport vehicle. His face was a pale, sickly shade of gray, perfectly reflecting the sheer magnitude of his total destruction. There would be absolutely no bail for a flight risk who owed millions to a violent underground syndicate. The heavy metal doors of the transport van slammed shut, permanently sealing his devastating fate. The swift hand of justice did not stop with my deeply treacherous son. Inside the towering corporate building, an emergency board of directors meeting was violently convened. Todd, the charismatic partner, who had eagerly planned to run away with my daughter-in-law, found himself completely cornered in the very boardroom he used to command. The audio recording of his twisted conversation with Megan had been quietly forwarded to the primary investors. The board members stared at him with cold, unforgiving disgust. Todd desperately tried to leverage his charm, frantically stammering out pathetic excuses and attempting to shift the entirety of the blame onto Bradley. But the financial trails Victoria uncovered completely implicated him as a willing accessory to the massive corporate fraud. He had actively helped falsify the quarterly profit margins to hide the bleeding accounts. The board voted unanimously to terminate his employment immediately, stripping him of his equity, his title, and his remaining dignity. Two massive corporate security guards flanked him, roughly grabbing him by the arms and publicly escorting him through the crowded bullpen. Dozens of former employees watched in absolute stunned silence as the smooth-talking salesman was thrown out onto the cold, concrete sidewalk. He was left clutching a miserable cardboard box of personal belongings, knowing full well that federal indictments for conspiracy and wire fraud were already being drafted, with his name boldly printed at the top. The extravagant European getaway he had promised Megan was now entirely replaced by the terrifying certainty of a federal prison cell. Miles away from the shattered corporate plaza, a completely different kind of agonizing reality was crashing down. Megan was standing in the dimly lit lobby of a remarkably cheap roadside motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. She was entirely stripped of her lavish Lincoln Park sanctuary and her wealthy country club status. She wore the same wrinkled designer dress she had scrambled away in on Friday night, but the expensive fabric was now stained and heavily creased. Her pristine makeup was ruined, completely washed away by 48 continuous hours of hysterical sobbing and profound panic. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered loudly, casting sickly yellow shadows across her exhausted face. She slid a sleek platinum credit card across the scratched laminate counter toward a deeply indifferent motel clerk. The clerk slowly swiped the card through the archaic machine. A sharp electronic buzz filled the incredibly tense air. "Declined?" The clerk stated flatly, sliding the plastic card back across the dirty counter. Megan let out a sharp, desperate gasp, shaking her head wildly. "That is completely impossible," she stammered, her voice cracking with sheer terror. "Try it again. Run it again right now. There is a massive spending limit on that account." The clerk sighed heavily and ran the magnetic strip through the machine a second time. The exact same harsh buzz echoed in the quiet lobby. "It is completely declined, lady." The clerk repeated, his tone entirely devoid of any basic human sympathy. Megan frantically dug through her expensive leather purse, pulling out 3 more premium credit cards. She practically threw them onto the counter, begging the man to test every single one. One by one, the electronic machine rejected them all. Victoria had flawlessly executed the asset freeze perfectly, locking Megan entirely out of the massive financial reservoirs she had ruthlessly planned to drain. The horrifying realization that she possessed absolutely nothing finally paralyzed her. She had no secret trust account in Geneva. She had no wealthy lover waiting to fly her to Switzerland. She was entirely penniless, standing on a filthy linoleum floor with no destination and no salvation. She gathered her useless plastic cards with violently trembling hands, completely suffocated by the immense crushing weight of her own monumental greed. She was trapped in a nightmare she had built entirely for herself. I remained incredibly peaceful, sitting quietly in the warm sunlit kitchen of my newly purchased coastal estate. The gentle sound of the ocean waves crashing against the rocky shoreline drifted softly through the open windows, completely replacing the toxic noise of the life I had entirely left behind. A steaming mug of dark coffee rested on the heavy marble island beside my new mobile phone. The digital screen suddenly lit up, signaling an incoming voicemail. I reached forward and calmly pressed the small speaker icon. Megan's voice instantly flooded the quiet kitchen. She was weeping with a raw, pathetic intensity, her breath hitching wildly between frantic, desperate words. "Dad. Please," she sobbed hysterically, the sound entirely stripped of her usual arrogant venom. "I have absolutely nowhere to go. I am so completely sorry for everything I said. Please just answer the phone. I am begging you to show me some mercy. I will do absolutely anything you ask. Please just help me." I listened to the entire pathetic recording, completely unmoving. The frail, forgiving father she was desperately trying to manipulate had died the moment I planted those audio transmitters. I looked at the digital screen, watching the seconds physically tick away on her miserable plea. I did not feel an ounce of pity or a single shred of remorse. I slowly lifted my calloused thumb and pressed it firmly against the red digital delete button on the smooth glass screen. The frantic, pathetic sobbing was instantly and permanently silenced forever. The slate was completely wiped clean. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking out at the beautiful horizon, finally breathing in the absolute peace of total, uncompromised justice. Exactly 2 months later, the cool, salty breeze blowing steadily off the vast Pacific Ocean brushed sharply against my face. I stood quietly on the expansive wraparound balcony of my sprawling coastal estate in Monterey, letting the spectacular morning sun warm my skin. The rhythmic crashing of the heavy saltwater waves, violently assaulting the jagged rocks far below, provided a deeply soothing soundtrack to my daily routine. I breathed in deeply, filling my lungs with the incredibly clean, crisp ocean air. For the first time in years, I felt profoundly and utterly alive, completely free from past burdens today, forever. The suffocating gray fog of constant betrayal, the exhausting daily performance of feigning mental decay, and the terrible heavy weight of my son and his malicious greed had completely vanished without a trace. I had successfully excised the rotting infection from my life with total, absolute surgical precision. The magnificent property surrounding me was entirely mine, free and clear of any lingering shadows or hidden parasitic agendas. I leaned my calloused hands heavily against the smooth wrought iron railing, looking out at the endless blue horizon, stretching perfectly across the spectacular, beautiful globe. I was isolated, but absolutely never lonely. A completely different kind of vibrant, highly productive energy now filled the massive halls of this beautiful estate. I turned my back to the spectacular ocean view and walked slowly through the towering glass patio doors, stepping back into the vast, magnificent library. The grand mahogany room was currently buzzing with intense, focused activity. I had invited a highly specialized, meticulously vetted group of brilliant professionals into my massive home for a deeply important operational summit. Half a dozen fiercely intelligent individuals sat comfortably around the massive custom-built wooden conference table. They were ready to execute my final orders. They were an elite assembly of highly aggressive civil litigation attorneys, relentless former federal prosecutors, and fiercely dedicated elder rights advocates. Victoria Lawson stood sharply at the head of the long table, efficiently organizing towering stacks of official legal binders with her usual terrifying, flawless precision. She looked up as I entered the quiet room, offering a single, highly respectful nod. Everyone immediately ceased their quiet murmuring, turning their undivided, absolute attention directly toward me. I walked purposefully toward the empty leather chair, waiting patiently for me at the far opposite end of the long, heavily polished, solid wooden table. "We are entirely ready to proceed with the final execution phase," Richard Victoria stated smoothly, her voice carrying that beautifully familiar clinical authority. "The massive commercial farms in Iowa have officially closed out their highly profitable quarterly harvest. The incredibly vast agricultural revenue streams have been fully successfully rerouted, completely bypassing the standard conservative holding accounts. We have perfectly secured the immense required capital exactly as you specifically mandated." I sat down heavily in the thick leather chair, resting my forearms firmly on the cool wooden table, absolutely fully prepared to finally initiate my ultimate, grand, incredibly powerful master plan. I looked carefully around the quiet room, making deliberate, direct eye contact with every single powerful advocate sitting patiently before me. For the past 2 months, we have been aggressively laying the deep foundation for an entirely new kind of defensive infrastructure. I began, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal intensity that demanded absolute respect. I have personally experienced the absolute darkest, deeply horrifying reality of human greed. I sat quietly in the suffocating shadows, watching my own flesh and blood enthusiastically plot to completely strip away my absolute freedom, my dignity, and my entire massive, hard-earned life savings. They actively utilized the complex legal system as a violent weapon to brutally discard me for their own selfish financial gain. I paused, letting the heavy, unvarnished truth sink deeply into the minds of the brilliant legal scholars sitting around my table. I possessed the massive, hidden financial resources required to violently shatter their terrible trap and forcefully turn the tables on my abusers. I continued slowly. I had the profound advantage of a massive secret inheritance, a brilliant legal ally, and the sheer physical stamina to wage a total, devastating, fully uncompromising, relentless war against their incredibly dark treachery. But the vast majority of elderly victims trapped in similar horrifying situations have absolutely nothing. They are entirely defenseless, completely isolated, and relentlessly crushed beneath the terrifying weight of their own predatory children. They simply fade away, quietly rotting in terrible state facilities, while their greedy families eagerly steal their entire hard-earned legacy. I reached out with my right hand, gently touching the thick, embossed leather folder, resting patiently in front of me on the smooth mahogany wood. That completely unacceptable, deeply tragic reality officially, totally, permanently ends proudly today, I stated firmly, looking directly at Victoria once again. Victoria stepped forward smoothly, opening the heavy folder and meticulously turning the thick parchment pages to reveal the final signature lines. I looked down at the bold, cleanly printed header resting perfectly at the top of the official document. The Caldwell Shield Foundation. It was a completely revolutionary, fiercely aggressive legal strike force, entirely dedicated to ruthlessly defending vulnerable elderly citizens from predatory financial abuse. It was a massive, fully funded nonprofit legal army designed specifically to violently hunt down, prosecute, and completely annihilate abusive family members who brutally attempted to ruthlessly, illegally, forcefully exploit the defenseless elderly population. I was taking the immense, staggering wealth generated by my father and his vast commercial farms and weaponizing every single penny of it. We were not going to simply offer polite legal advice or passive, gentle mediation. We were going to actively launch devastating financial audits, forcefully freeze stolen assets, and aggressively file massive criminal fraud charges against the most dangerous predators hiding quietly in plain sight. We were going completely on the offensive. Victoria leaned down carefully, placing a beautiful heavy silver fountain pen directly into my scarred, heavily calloused right hand. I gripped the cool, polished, solid metal. The elegant, expensive writing instrument felt completely natural, resting comfortably inside my rough, heavily calloused hands. My fingers were still permanently marked by decades of brutal physical labor, by endless years of intensely hard, honest work on dangerous commercial construction sites. My father had taught me the profound, incredible value of building a strong, completely unshakable foundation before you ever attempt to construct the house. He built his massive legacy through exhausting, back-breaking labor, and I had successfully used his brilliant, quiet investments to completely eradicate the toxic, deeply parasitic rot from my own extremely pathetic, severely weak bloodline. Now I was using that exact same powerful, unyielding foundation to build an impenetrable, absolute shield for thousands of defenseless, innocent people. I pressed the sharp silver nib of the pen firmly against the thick, creamy parchment paper. The ink flowed smoothly, flawlessly, transferring my name permanently onto the binding legal documents. I rapidly signed the primary foundation charter, the aggressive operational mandates, and the incredibly massive multi-million-dollar initial funding check required to instantly activate our brilliant legal strike force. I had successfully taken the absolute greatest, darkest, most profoundly devastating pain and finally transformed it into purpose. Later that evening, I stepped out onto the expansive wooden deck of my beautiful coastal estate. The cool, salty breeze of the Pacific Ocean washed gently over my face, carrying away the final lingering traces of the heavy, oppressive stress I had endured back in Chicago. The sky was transforming into a brilliant canvas of fiery orange and deep bruised purple as the massive sun began its slow, deliberate descent toward the calm water. I stood perfectly still, resting my calloused hands on the smooth cedar railing. My fingers traced the natural grain of the wood, a comforting reminder of the countless hours of grueling physical labor that had defined my entire life. For 40 years, I had sacrificed everything. I had broken my body and compromised my own peace to provide a flawless, comfortable existence for my only son. I had constructed a pristine world for him, building tall, sturdy walls to protect him from the harsh realities of consequence. But in doing so, I had inadvertently raised a man who placed absolutely no value on loyalty. I raised a man who saw my physical aging not as a testament to my lifelong sacrifice, but as an inconvenient vulnerability to be ruthlessly exploited. I lifted a heavy crystal glass from the small patio table beside me. The rich amber liquid swirled smoothly, catching the fading light of the dying sun. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive bourbon, letting the warm, fiery sensation settle deeply into my chest. A profound, absolute peace enveloped my entire being. The chaotic noise of my past life, the frantic demands, the forced smiles, the underlying treachery was permanently silenced. As I looked out at the vast, endless horizon, I thought deeply about the true nature of kinship. Society teaches us that family is an unbreakable bond forged entirely by genetics. We are conditioned to believe that blood automatically commands unconditional devotion. But that is a dangerous, carefully constructed illusion. Blood simply provides a biological connection. It does not guarantee character. It does not ensure kindness. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty and respect do. Bradley had completely forgotten who raised him. He thought he could easily discard me. He thought he could quietly bury me in a cheap, decaying nursing home because he looked at me and only saw an old, tired man who was no longer useful to his bottom line. He genuinely believed that my quiet demeanor was a sign of total, pathetic weakness, but he made a catastrophic miscalculation. He forgot that the roots of a tree that weathered 40 brutal years of violent storms go incredibly deep into the cold, hard earth. An old tree does not fall easily. It stands firm, anchored by decades of silent endurance. When the vicious winds of his betrayal finally struck, I did not break. I simply stood my ground and let his own treacherous storm completely tear him apart. The Caldwell Shield Foundation will now stand as a permanent monument to justice. We will aggressively dismantle the hidden financial abuse that thrives in dark corners. We will actively hunt down every single family member who believes they can legally rob the vulnerable. They will rapidly learn that advancing age does not automatically equate to surrender or quiet, silent, permanent, devastating defeat. I am no longer the grieving widower shuffling through a house where I was secretly despised. I am a man who has entirely reclaimed his power, his dignity, and his absolute freedom. My future is no longer tied to the selfish whims of a deeply corrupt son. It is entirely mine to shape, to enjoy, and to use for a greater protective purpose. I took another slow, quiet sip of the smooth bourbon, closing my eyes as the crashing waves provided a beautiful natural rhythm to the peaceful evening. The battle was officially over, and I had won. If there is one single thing you take away from my story, let it be this: never mistake silence for ignorance and never assume that age equates to weakness. When the people you sacrificed everything for begin to view you as a burden rather than a blessing, you owe it to yourself to stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. Financial abuse in families thrives in the shadows of guilt and misplaced loyalty. Shine a light on it. You have the absolute right to protect your dignity, your peace, and your future, no matter who stands against you. Did this story resonate with you? Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Let me know in the comments below. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences so we can keep supporting each other. Stay very strong.